The world's most prestigious aircraft crashes. More than 100 people are dead.
On July 25, 2000, people at Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport were horrified to see a fast Concorde take off in flames from the runway. With a fire raging and two engines that wouldn't start, the pilots worked hard to keep their heavy plane in the air, hurtling along just above the ground in a desperate race against time. There was no way they could win that race. Air France Flight 4590 stopped, spun, and crashed into a hotel in the Paris suburb of Gonesse less than 1 minute after takeoff, killing all 109 people on board and 4 people on the ground. The world was shocked when a Concorde was lost in a terrible accident. The famous supersonic airplane had been in the air for 24 years without an accident. Its beautiful shape and Mach 2 cruising speed inspired millions of people. It was hard to believe that this plane would crash so soon after takeoff in the 21st century. Investigators would find a series of mistakes that started weeks before the disaster on a Continental Airlines DC-10 over the ocean. But some say that a small metal strip caused the plane to crash. This is such a strange idea that no one could believe it. But it's true. Let's try to figure out how. At the start of the 1960s, everyone thought that the jet age would only be a short-term phase on the way to the much more important era, the age of rapid transportation. Jets cut the time it took to fly in half, but those times could be cut in half again if airliners could break the sound barrier and fly in the zone where they were most efficient. At that time, every hopeful pilot's dream was to fly Concorde. For people who wanted to ride on it, just the thought of it made them feel like a child again. It didn't matter that the cabin was small and crowded, or that the tiny windows or the fast takeoffs and landings made people feel anything from mild fear to total terror. When you got home, you could tell your friends that you flew on Concorde at twice the speed of sound. What did any of that mean? There were 100 people at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris on July 25, 2000, ready to board Air France Flight 4590, a private Concorde service from Paris to New York. With Concorde's top speed, they would get to New York in a little more than 3 hours, which is twice as fast as a normal commercial flight. But Concorde was often late, and today was no different. Boarding started 45 minutes late so that engineers could fix a broken thrust reverser. The crew and dispatchers on Flight 4590 had to figure out a tough organizational puzzle. There were 100 people on board, 9 crew members, a lot of luggage, and 95,000 kilograms of fuel, which was enough to fill all 9 tanks to the top. It took some wrestling with the numbers to get the plane below its maximum takeoff weight of 185,070 kilograms, but there were still some problems after the pilots were sure they were within the limits. 19 bags were put in the back luggage compartment without being added to the load sheet. The pilots thought the plane would use the usual 2,000 kilograms of fuel during taxi. The pilots decided that they would take off at the weight limit of the plane, even though they knew these assumptions were wrong. It would turn out that the plane was actually flying outside of what was allowed by experts. The real weight of the plane was at least 700 kilograms more than the maximum weight for takeoff in those conditions. Its center of gravity was also at least 54.2% farther back than the maximum of 54%. These were just the most conservative estimates. The real amounts exceeded could have been a lot more. These limits are not a hard line that the plane won't cross, but when the crew of Flight 4590 went over them, they took away a lot of the safety cushion that would have kept the plane safe from unexpected events during takeoff. At 16:42, after finishing up a few last things on the checklist, the team was given permission to take off. The 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines roared to life as Captain Marty pushed the throttles all the way to full power for takeoff. It felt like people were pushed back against their seats as the plane was thrown down the runway at an incredible speed. The deep, earth-shaking scream turned heads all over the airport. It was the clear sound that let everyone within a few kilometers know that Concorde was in the air. Following 23 seconds of the takeoff run, First Officer Marcotte yelled 100 knots, and 9 seconds later he said V1, which was the fastest speed at which the lift could be stopped. At the 16:43 and 10-second mark, bad things started to happen. The inner front tire on the left main landing gear of the Concorde hit a metal strip that was sitting on the runway edgewise. The plane was going very fast. The strip immediately cut deep into the heavily inflated tire, breaking it apart with a huge amount of force. In less than a second, pieces of metal and rubber started flying everywhere, ripping through wires, breaking the landing gear doors, and hitting the bottom of the wing. Right away, fuel started to leak from a hole in fuel tank #5. It streaked back in front of the engine intakes and landing gear bays, where flying objects damaged a wire and set it on fire. When a big flame column appeared under the left wing, fuel and rough air mixed together and made both engines on that side lose power. Engines 1 and 2 were shaken by violent surges as air from the combustion chambers pushed its way back out and through the intakes. The plane began to veer to the left because of uneven power and a broken left gear, which pulled it away from the center line of the runway. Before Concorde, a fully loaded Boeing 747 with French President Jacques Chirac on board was stopped on a taxiway off the left side of runway 26R. Chirac had just returned from a trip to Japan. First Officer Marcotte yelled as the broken-down Concorde swerved toward the 747. Captain Marty pushed the rudder all the way to the right and raised the nose to get the plane flying. He knew that if the plane went into the grass, it would probably hit the 747 in the middle of the field. Even though the plane was still 11 knots slower than usual, Marty felt he had to do what he had to do. Flight engineer Jardinot told the pilots, "Stop!" because the plane would be in big trouble if it took off with 2 engines that were dying. But air traffic control replied, "Concorde 4590, you have flames behind you," over their shout. The people on Chirac's 747 were horrified as the burning Concorde flew over several runway edge lights and then jerked into the air, flying right past the pilots' seats as they watched in shock. Flight engineer Jardinot called out, failure engine 2, on Air France flight 4590. After 1 second, the heat of the fire set off the #2 engine fire warning circuit, which set off the fire alarm bell. Both engines 1 and 2 were no longer making power by this point. As the plane flew over a group of airport buildings, pieces of the left wing started to fall to the rooftops below. The plane was so low that the flames from the engine melted the shirt of a messenger who was caught in the path of the flight. But Concorde had run out of time and speed. At that point, the plane slowed down below the minimum speed needed to keep steering, even though 2 of its engines were failing. The left wing dropped and the plane rolled 113 degrees to the left, going upside down as it went toward the ground. The hotel and most of the Concorde had already been burned to the ground by the time firefighters from the airport and local towns got there. Even though firefighters ran to put out the fire, it was clear that no one on the plane could have reached safety. All 109 people on board were killed. The whole world was shocked when the Concorde crashed. But no one thought that Concorde would crash, even though there was nothing about it that made it impossible. This was all about the crash of France Flight 4590 due to a small metal strip. So sometimes it is all about time. Even a small piece of strip can kill more than 100 people. Now tell me in the comments about which accident you want to know about in the next video, and drop a like if you want to pay tribute to those crew members who tried to their last breath to save all the passengers, but unfortunately, they couldn't.